Section 39 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Ann Walden. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Uterus. Womb. The uterus is a hollow, thick-walled, muscular organ situated deeply in the pelvic cavity between the bladder and rectum. Into its upper part the uterine tubes open, one on either side, while below its cavity communicates with that of the vagina. When the ova are discharged from the ovaries, they are carried to the uterine cavity through the uterine tubes. If an ovum be fertilized, it embeds itself in the uterine wall, and is normally retained in the uterus until prenatal development is completed, the uterus undergoing changes in size and structure to accommodate itself to the needs of the growing embryo. After parturition, the uterus returns almost to its former condition, but certain traces of its enlargement remains. It is necessary, therefore, to describe as the type form the adult virgin uterus, and then to consider the modifications which are effected as a result of pregnancy. In the virgin state, the uterus is flattened antero-posteriorly and is piriform in shape, with the apex directed downward and backward. It lies between the bladder in front and the pelvic or sigmoid colon and rectum behind, and is completely within the pelvis, so that its base is below the level of the superior pelvic aperture. Its upper part is suspended by the broad and the round ligaments, while its lower portion is embedded in the fibrous tissue of the pelvis. The long axis of the uterus usually lies approximately in the axis of the superior pelvic aperture, but as the organ is freely movable, its position varies with the state of distension of the bladder and rectum. Except when much displaced by a fully distended bladder, it forms a forward angle with the vagina, since the axis of the vagina corresponds to the axes of the cavity and inferior aperture of the pelvis. The uterus measures about 7.5 cm in length, 5 cm in breadth at its upper part, and nearly 2.5 cm in thickness. It weighs from 30 to 40 grams. It is divisible into two portions. On the surface, about midway between the apex and base, is a slight constriction known as the isthmus, and corresponding to this in the interior is a narrowing of the uterine cavity, the internal orifice of the uterus. The portion above the isthmus is termed the body, and that below the cervix. The part of the body which lies above a plane passing through the points of entrance of the uterine tubes is known as the fundus. Body, corpus uteri. The body gradually narrows from the fundus to the isthmus. The vesicle or anterior surface, facies vesicalis, is flattened and covered by peritoneum, which is reflected onto the bladder to form the vesico-uterine excavation. The surface lies in apposition with the bladder. The intestinal or posterior surface, facies intestinalis, is convex transversely and is covered by peritoneum, which is continued down onto the cervix and vagina. It is in relation with the sigmoid colon, from which it is usually separated by some coils of small intestine. The fundus, fundus uteri, is convex in all directions, and covered by peritoneum, continuous with that on the vesical and intestinal surfaces. On it rest some coils of small intestine, and occasionally the distended sigmoid colon. The lateral margins, margo lateralis, are slightly convex. At the upper end of each the uterine tube pierces the uterine wall. Below and in front of this point the round ligament of the uterus is fixed, while behind it is the attachment of the ligament of the ovary. These three structures lie within a fold of peritoneum which is reflected from the margin of the uterus to the wall of the pelvis, and is named the broad ligament. Cervix, cervix uteri, neck. The cervix is the lower constricted segment of the uterus. It is somewhat conical in shape, with its truncated apex directed downward and backward, but is slightly wider in the middle than either above or below. Owing to its relationships, it is less freely movable than the body, so that the latter may bend on it. The long axis of the cervix is therefore seldom in the same straight line as the long axis of the body. The long axis of the uterus as a whole presents the form of a curved line, with its concavity forward, or in extreme cases may present an angular bend at the region of the isthmus. The cervix projects through the anterior wall of the vagina, which divides it into an upper supravaginal portion and a lower vaginal portion. The supravaginal portion, portio supravaginalis, cervicis, is separated in front from the bladder by fibrous tissue, parametrium, which extends also onto its sides and lateralward between the layers of the broad ligaments. The uterine arteries reach the margins of the cervix in this fibrous tissue, while on either side the ureter runs downward and forward in it, at a distance of about 2 cm from the cervix. Posteriorly, the supravaginal cervix is covered by peritoneum, which is prolonged below onto the posterior vaginal wall, when it is reflected onto the rectum, forming the recto-uterine excavation. It is in relation with the rectum, from which it may be separated by coils of small intestine. The vaginal portion, portio vaginalis cervicis, of the cervix, projects free into the anterior wall of the vagina between the anterior and posterior fornices. On its rounded extremity is a small, depressed, somewhat circular aperture, the external orifice of the uterus, through which the cavity of the cervix communicates with that of the vagina. The external orifice is bounded by 2 lips, an anterior and a posterior, of which the anterior is the shorter and thicker, although, on account of the slope of the cervix, it projects lower than the posterior. Normally both lips are in contact with the posterior vaginal wall. Interior of the uterus. The cavity of the uterus is small in comparison with the size of the organ. The cavity of the body, cavum uteri, is a mere slit, flattened antero-posteriorly. It is triangular in shape, the base being formed by the internal surface of the fundus between the orifices of the uterine tubes, the apex by the internal orifice of the uterus through which the cavity of the body communicates with the canal of the cervix. The canal of the cervix, canalus cervicis uteri, is somewhat fusiform, flattened from before backward, and broader at the middle than at either extremity. It communicates above through the internal orifice with the cavity of the body, and below through the external orifice with the vaginal cavity. The wall of the canal presents an anterior and a posterior longitudinal ridge, from each of which proceed a number of small oblique columns, the palmate folds, giving the appearance of branches from the stem of a tree. To this arrangement the name arbor vitae uterina is applied. The folds on the 2 walls are not exactly opposed, but fit between one another so as to close the cervical canal. The total length of the uterine cavity from the external orifice to the fundus is about 6.25 cm. Ligaments. The ligaments of the uterus are 8 in number: 1 anterior, 1 posterior, 2 lateral or broad, 2 uterosacral, and 2 round ligaments. The anterior ligament consists of the vesico-uterine fold of peritoneum, which is reflected onto the bladder from the front of the uterus, at the junction of the cervix and body. The posterior ligament consists of the recto-vaginal fold of peritoneum, which is reflected from the back of the posterior fornix of the vagina onto the front of the rectum. It forms the bottom of a deep pouch called the recto-uterine excavation, which is bounded in front by the posterior wall of the uterus, the supravaginal cervix, and the posterior fornix of the vagina, behind by the rectum, and laterally by 2 crescentic folds of peritoneum which pass backward from the cervix uteri on either side of the rectum to the posterior wall of the pelvis. These folds are named the sacrogenital or recto-uterine folds. They contain a considerable amount of fibrous tissue and non-striped muscular fibers, which are attached to the front of the sacrum and constitute the uterosacral ligaments. The 2 lateral or broad ligaments, ligamentum latum uteri, pass from the sides of the uterus to the lateral walls of the pelvis. Together with the uterus they form a septum across the female pelvis, dividing that cavity into 2 portions. In the anterior part is contained the bladder, in the posterior part the rectum, and in certain conditions some coils of the small intestine and a part of the sigmoid colon. Between the 2 layers of each broad ligament are contained: 1. The uterine tube superiorly; 2. The round ligament of the uterus; 3. The ovary and its ligament. 4.